welcome you all to the International Roundtable on Indigenous Children's Voices and Rights. My name is Odette. I'm the Program Manager of the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiatives. So today I'll be acting as your Zoom operator. So you will see me on and off. That's why I just wanted to say hi. And now I'm just gonna hand things over to my colleague, Ella Martinez, who will introduce herself and will serve as a moderator.
Thank you, Odette. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on your time zones. Thank you so much for joining us today for this International Roundtable on Indigenous Children's Voices and Rights, implementing the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child by encouraging Indigenous children's voices. As Odette mentioned, my name is Elianis Martinez, also Ella. I am the Program Coordinator for the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative. I will be acting as your moderator today, along with my colleague Zuneida Musa Wadiwala.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. My name is Zuneida Musa Wadiwala, and I'm from Johannesburg, South Africa, where I am admitted by the High Court as attorney, conveyancer, and notary public. Today's event brings together children and youth from different countries, as well as experts who are working to promote Indigenous people's rights and children's rights for an interactive dialogue to raise awareness and speak up for Indigenous children's rights and the Global Sustainable Development Goals. To begin this event, we are truly honored to welcome Elder Philemon Sanderson, who will provide the opening prayer. Elder Philemon Sanderson, born in the mid-1940s, is an Indigenous day school survivor and had her child taken away without cause, except for the fact that she was Indigenous, which makes her a survivor of the 60s scoop mother. Elder Sanderson is a member of the Muslim First Nation and was able to obtain reunification with her scooped child some 21 years later. Elder Sanderson's first language is Plains Cree. She is a respected female elder in her community who is invited to attend and preside as elder at various Indigenous and non-Indigenous functions, meetings, and events. Elder Sanderson has 4 children, 15 grandchildren, and 12 great-grandchildren. She is an active member of her community and plays a central role in her family.
I am now thrilled to welcome and introduce Squackwash Dustin Moore, who is a wonderful young advocate for the rights of Indigenous peoples and will give today opening remarks for the event. Welcome, Squackwash, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So Yedikshin Wenwen, Hanshquesh, Squackwash Dunstan Moore. Good afternoon. My name is Squackwash, which translates to sunshine. I am of Nickelchaam, Statliam, Yakima, and Irish descent from Kumshin, also known as Lytton, British Columbia. But I currently reside on the Anishinaabe Algonquin territory, here also known as Ottawa. I am a junior policy analyst in the environment branch at the Assembly of First Nations, and in June, I completed a parliamentary internship for the environment with Environmental Leadership Canada. The first part of my internship, I worked within the Senate of Canada, supporting Senator Mary Coyle, as well as the Senators for Climate Solutions. Then the second part of my internship, I researched the racial, ethnic, and gender identities of House Committee witnesses. As of a couple days ago, I completed my term on the first cohort of the Environment and Climate Change Youth Council, where I chaired the 2022-2023 year. I'm also a member of the Youth Advisory Group with the Canadian Commission of UNESCO, where I sit on the UN International Decade of Indigenous Languages and the Education for Sustainable Development expert working groups. My background is heavily focused on the environment and climate. But as an Indigenous youth, at the core of everything I do, I am a loud advocate for Indigenous rights, climate justice, and youth, creating space for BIPOC, 2S LGBTQIA+ folks, women and girls, and to all the voices who are typically left out. As young people, we are growing up in an interesting time. We are literally in the era of youth. Throughout history, we have not seen the programming, resources, and education that we have today. So what do we take from that? How can we make it better for the next generation? Because it was the generations before us that worked tirelessly so we could have the spaces like this one now. The steps we take now as young people, as we grow, not only make it better for the generations after us, but also for us. This can feel like an impossible task, especially as young people. The responsibility we feel can be overwhelming, intimidating, maybe even unachievable. I know I felt it. The barriers and challenges Indigenous youth face growing up add to those feelings. I shared a bit of my professional background. There are days I feel the imposter syndrome and convince myself that all the work I've done was luck. I was lucky. That's what I convinced myself. I could not acknowledge the hard work it takes to be in these spaces. Indigenous youth live in two worlds. We learn our Indigenous ways of knowing from our families, elders, communities, and culture, knowledge that is generations worth of wisdom. Then because of the society we live in, we're expected to learn the Western and colonial way. We recognize the gaps and barriers early on, but because of our age, our expertise is not acknowledged. Then later on, when it is, it feels like luck because we're finally being listened to. This cycle has to end. And imagine what our world would look like when it finally does. Indigenous youth being unapologetically loud and proud, taking up space, being involved in decision-making processes, our age not being seen as a weakness, but inspiration. Our knowledge being recognized as the generational wisdom it is. This is our future and not one where we feel lucky to finally be heard. We are ending the cycle for us and future generations. Before ending, I just want to share my gratitude to all the young people here today. I know that these things can be very overwhelming, tiring, and kind of scary. As young people, we sometimes are expected to know how to regulate our feelings within minutes, but just know that it's okay to be overwhelmed and scared and anxious. It takes a lot of courage to be here. So remember to breathe, feel your feelings, and be unapologetically yourself. I was here last year, so thank you for bringing me back to do the opening remarks. I've always loved being a part of this space. So if we could just virtually give a hand to all the young people who are going to be speaking in the panel and after me, to you for our youth here, our young leaders, and our world changers. Kukshem.
Thank you so much, Squawkwash, for your inspiring opening remarks.
And we are now deeply honored and happy to introduce Ms. Portia Garnett-Williams, who will deliver the keynote speech in representation of Voices of Future Generations Indigenous Leadership Commission. Portia is Plains Cree from Treaty 6, Moosomin First Nation, and is the direct descendant of a 60s Scoop survivor. She is a third-year undergraduate student of political science and international relations at the University of Toronto Trinity College. She is a senior editor for the online journal Harmony, Youth Voices on Science, Law, and Sustainability. She is also a passionate advocate for Indigenous rights, having partnered with the charity I Love First Peoples to bring awareness to and raise funds for Indigenous children living in Northern Canada. A very warm welcome to you, Portia, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction. I am so honored to be back with the annual International Roundtable on Indigenous children's voices and rights, to honor Indigenous youth voices and create a dialogue for supporting Indigenous children's rights and voices today. Thank you for inviting me back to this roundtable discussion, and what beautiful opening remarks, Sunshine, that was wonderful. We come together today to celebrate and honor Indigenous voices, specifically of our youth. And in the short time that I have today, I really want to convey the importance of Indigenous children's voices, specifically in the context of uplifting them in schools, in our education systems, and society even more broadly. So very interconnected parts. And I really want to start this discussion by just creating a space for fostering hope, or that's really what I want you to take away from this. A bit about me. So I'm Plains Cree, Treaty 6, Moosomin First Nation, and I grew up in Ottawa, and that's where I'm currently residing at the moment. And I went to public elementary school and high school in the area. Compared to my parents' generation, or even my older brothers, he's 7 years older than me, a lot has changed in a matter of years in what is taught about Indigenous people in schools. I was brought up with an understanding that Indigenous people have been on this land since time immemorial. And from a very young age, I understood what reconciliation was. And surprisingly enough, so did some of my school colleagues. Starting in grade 2, my class was actually taught about residential schools. In more recent years, some of my political science classes in university have expanded the conversation, speaking on the national inquiry of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in Canada. There is no doubt that positive steps have been taken in the past several years, but make no mistake, there is a long way to go to put the spotlight on Indigenous stories. When I was in grade 10 in a history class, I gave a presentation on my family's history, speaking on the 60s scoop, and asked my classmates to raise their hand if they knew what the 60s scoop was, so I could understand what kind of conversation I was about to have. And only one student in a class of roughly 25 raised their hand. In history classes, there continues to be a prominent Western myth of greatness, which erases settler colonial wrongdoings from history and fails to mention the success and innovation of Indigenous societies. In literature classes, rarely are there ever stories told by Indigenous authors, or even Indigenous stories, period. The narrative, while improving, still continues to be predominantly Western and non-Indigenous. And more importantly, or most importantly, what I really want to emphasize today is Indigenous people are often talked about in schools in the past tense alone. We forget that we need to foster hope for an Indigenous future by not only looking towards the past, which is very important, but the future as well. As a child, my understanding of who I was rooted in the past, specifically in trauma. I associated being Indigenous with the 60s scoop, day schools, residential schools, cultural assimilation. I did not associate being Indigenous with excellence and prosperity. Admittedly, it can be very challenging to do so, to find that hope through all of the past trauma. So where do we find hope? The answer, to a great extent, is in the future of Indigenous people. The Indigenous youth here today are absolutely a part of this important change in the narrative. And today's roundtable dialogue is centered around uplifting Indigenous youth and creating opportunities. And while our roundtable must be centered around the past and what Indigenous people have endured through colonization, the narrative today is one of healing and not just what Indigenous prosperity could look like, but what it will look like. And I'm thrilled to see the participation today, especially from our roundtable speakers and our youth. However, these dialogues on a future for Indigenous people are so far and rare in schools. How do we ensure that we have more of these dialogues with Indigenous youth perspectives? And how do we ensure that they're prominent in important places like schools and the workplace? I'm a strong believer that inclusion comes from leadership. To teachers, mentors, parents, and leaders, I encourage you to incorporate Indigenous leaders into your spaces. Not only do they oftentimes bring Indigenous worldviews into conversation about land and language, but they can also be exemplary figures of success and prosperity. I also encourage leaders to create Indigenous networks within their schools or places of work, finding an Indigenous network and creating regular spaces for these kinds of dialogues between Indigenous people can go a long way in fostering hope. Because it takes courage to speak up about Indigenous rights, especially in schools. And that is why I'm also very proud to see many Indigenous voices on the call today, speaking on Indigenous children's rights and voices. It takes lots of courage to speak in front of so many people. So I thank you all for coming today. And I hope that today's roundtable can center around this dialogue of healing and opportunity and prosperity within the important context of the challenges that lie ahead. I hope that many can leave this discussion today inspired to continue these regular dialogues and conversations in their schools and education systems. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass it back to our heads of the conference.
Moving on to a very exciting part of this event, we are thrilled to celebrate the winners of the recent call for Indigenous child authors. This year's contest, which was possible thanks to a grant from the National 60 Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada, invited young Indigenous storytellers to share their unique voices and perspectives while highlighting the resiliency and cultural heritage of their families and communities. So I will now announce the winners, starting with the Silver Award that goes to Master Donnie Beardy with the story The Rain and the Sacred Fire. Donnie is 10 years old from Little Saskatchewan First Nation and Wik-Wemikong First Nation. He is a grade 5 student at Darwin School in Winnipeg, Manitoba. He is passionate about sports, especially basketball, soccer, and hockey. And he enjoys reading, drawing, and exploring various forms of art. Donnie's story is inspired by his Indigenous heritage and the traditions of his family. Congratulations, Donnie. Now we will announce the Gold Award, which goes to Dominic Beardy with the story Lessons from the Ancestors. Dominic is 9 years old from Little Saskatchewan First Nation and Wik-Wemikong First Nation. He is a proud student at Darwin School in Winnipeg, Manitoba, where he attends 3rd grade. He enjoys playing soccer and reading. In the future, he would like to be a professional soccer player and a published author. Through his story, Lessons from the Ancestors, he wants to inspire Indigenous children to uphold their culture. Congratulations, Dominic. And the Platinum Award goes to Sydney Winter Nisjak. Sydney belongs to the Nisga'a Nation and Haisla Nations. She is passionate about learning. Science and English are her favorite subjects, and she plays the guitar and piano for fun. She is also a dedicated basketball player and helped her basketball team win the championship at the Junior All-Native in 2024. Her awareness around the history of Indigenous people and the rights of the child has inspired her to write her story, as the 60 Scoop has had a direct impact on her family. Sydney's story was encouraged by her family's resilience, and she wants to inspire Indigenous youth to advocate for their rights and the rights of their communities, and to be a beacon of hope and light for older and younger generations. Congratulations, Sydney. We also want to recognize other winners who were unable to attend today's event. In the silver category, we want to recognize Daira Juarez with the story Culture Equality and Dulce Hernandez with the story Gardens of the Sacred Tree. And in the silver category, we recognize Temayani Hernandez with the story Julio's Village. We invite all speakers and attendees to join us in congratulating these wonderful young storytellers and giving them a virtual round of applause. To continue celebrating, I am thrilled to introduce Ms. Adeline Newman-Ting, who will share a few words of congratulations. Adeline was the first Indigenous child author of the Voices of the Future Generations Children's Initiative, and her book, Finding the Language, highlights the importance of preserving Indigenous languages, ensuring equality education for all, and protecting the rights of children. Addie is 13 years old from British Columbia. Her traditional name is Kesugilak, which means leader and born to be, and her Chinese name is Ting Li Wen. Most recently, she gave a TEDx talk with her father, Carrie Newman, and spoke at an educational event for the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation.
Hi, again, my name is Adeline Newman-Ting, and I am one of the Indigenous child authors. I just wanted to say congratulations for winning the contest and writing your books. You can get to do cool events like this through the Voices of Future Generations initiative. And it's always really fun to have a book that you've written that's gotten this far.
Thank you, Addie, for your words of congratulations and encouragement. And as we continue celebrating the winners of the competition, Donnie, Dominic, and Sydney, will share a few words about their stories and what inspired them. Starting with Donnie and Dominic, who are both joining us from Winnipeg, Manitoba. Over to you, Donnie and Dominic.
Can we see your medals?
Yes, show us your medals. Yeah. How does it feel to be winners of the competition?
It feels great, yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about what inspired your stories? What about you, Donnie? What inspired you to write your story, The Rain of the Sacred Fire?
Inspired me by writing the story.
You were inspired by your family and the traditions in your family. We know that these events can be a little bit scary to be in front of the camera. So thank you so much for showing us your medal and being present today. And Dominic, do you want to share something? How you feel and what inspired your story? And
what inspires my story is because I never really got to do this thing that much, and I'm just proud to be in this.
Thank you.
And also proud to be Indigenous.
Thank you so much, Dominic. We are very happy to hear how you feel and that you're proud of yourself. And we are also very proud of you for all the effort that you both did in writing your story ideas. And you still are developing your stories further so that can be ready to publish on the website. And we are super excited to share them with everybody to read because they are such wonderful stories with very beautiful and inspiring messages for everybody, including other Indigenous children. So thank you so much for being here with us today, and congratulations again.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, congratulations. Round of applause, please, everybody.
Yes. We also have Sydney Winter-Nisjok, who will share a few words about her upcoming book as our platinum winner. And she will also share an excerpt of her book. So over to you, Sydney.
My name is Sydney Nisjok. I'm 13 years old. I come from the Nisga'a Nation, belonging to the Frog Clan, and Haisla Nation, belonging to the Eagle Clan. Reading about our history is a start to understand the struggles that our people had since colonization, and the strength we must have to overcome a lot of unfairness. It is hard knowing our people were mistreated by the government, and it still does happen today. The 60 scoop refers to large numbers of Indigenous children who are taken from their families in the 1960s. Most of these children were adopted by non-Indigenous families in Canada and the United States. The government was a part of their plan to remove Indigenous children from community and culture. My story came together when my Baba shared his story of him and his siblings. My Baba's life was affected by the 60 scoop. His siblings were taken and he was able to find them later in life. There is still a lot of unknown in our family. But what I do know is that my Baba was brought up by our family, and a young adult, he was trying to find his siblings that were taken. He was reunited, and that was the basis of my story. I'll read part of my story now. When Jimmy woke up the next day, the first thing he did was check his phone to see if his friends had answered. Billy had, but James still must have been sleeping. Billy had texted their group chat an idea, and a good one at that. His idea was for all of them to gather information about the rights of Indigenous children and to figure out who could help them. Jimmy agreed with the idea, and they could compare the information next week. As Jimmy was about to put his phone down, James texted back and agreed to do some research. Jimmy wasted no time started researching everything he could about the 60s scoop and what the government and universities were doing to help survivors from the 60s scoop. He also learned about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 10 to reduce inequality within and among countries. Before he knew it, it was time to have supper with his family. That evening, he tried to relax but was not able to, so he researched some more. Jimmy and his friends, that's the end of the chapter. Jimmy and his friends were able to help his grandfather find and reunite the brothers through knowledge and the changes made for the right of the child and Indigenous people. My story is on history of our people. It gives children and families the opportunity to learn and to speak about our truth and the hope that our families have never lost. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Sydney. This is such a wonderful story, and we cannot wait to publish the fully illustrated book, which will be available on the BFG website, as well as Donnie and Dominic's stories. Now, I want to hand over the stage back to my colleague Zunaida, who will be introducing the next activity.
It is now a pleasure to introduce the Roundtable on Indigenous Children's Voices and Rights. The discussion will be chaired by Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger and co-chaired by Advocate Nishan Gunasekera. Professor Marie-Claire Cordonnier-Seger is a world-leading scholar and jurist in the field of sustainable development law and governance. She serves as chair in sustainable development law and policy at the University of Cambridge, where she is also law fellow, director of studies, and program director in Lucy Cavendish College. Further, as senior director of the Centre for International Sustainable Development Law, executive secretary of the Climate Law and Governance Initiative for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and chair of the United Nations Convention on Biodiversity Law and Governance Initiative. She has published over 24 books and over 160 papers in 5 languages, holds over 20 years of international treaty negotiations, executive and capacity building experience spanning over 80 countries, and has been elected Fellow of Royal Society of Canada in the Academy of Social Sciences, a Fellow of Royal Society of the Arts in the United Kingdom, and laureate of the prestigious His Excellency Judge Christopher Gregory Weeramantry International Justice Award, the Justitia Fundamentum Regnarum and the Leverhulme Trust Visiting Professorship of the University of Cambridge for the period 2020 to 2022, among other international honors. And thank you so much for joining us today. And Advocate Nishan Gunasekera is an international lawyer, educationist, leadership coach, facilitator, and environmentalist from Sri Lanka. He is committed to bringing communities together for environmental protection, healing, and conservation through the use of intergenerational, holistic, and experiential learning. He is currently a visiting fellow at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law in Lund, Sweden, and is co-chair of the Peace and Disarmament Commission in the Working Group of the United Nations Summit of the Future. Nishan has supported and advised several international organizations, including the United Nations agencies and the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN. In 2020, he was bestowed with His Excellency Judge Christopher Gregory Weeramantry International Justice Award for his work for the cause of justice and inclusion of all peoples during and after conflicts. He is also the lead counsel for the Voices of Future Generations Children's Initiative. Welcome, Nishan, and thank you for joining us today. I now leave you all in the very good hands of Professor Marie-Claire and Advocate Nishan.
Thank you so much, Zunaida, for that generous introduction. And thank you also especially to Odette and Ella for their tireless efforts to bring us to this wonderful point of being able to congratulate, together with Addie, our wonderful new winners. Donnie, Dominic, Sydney, your stories are beautiful, and it's an honor and a privilege to be able to celebrate them. Thank you also to Elder Philomene Sanderson and to Sunshine Dunstan-Moore, and to Portia for your beautiful opening remarks. They're deeply appreciated. I think for this roundtable, we have a wonderful set of questions to address together. I will turn to Nishan to introduce some of the invited.
Thank you very much, Professor Marie-Claire and Zunaida, for that very generous introduction. And echoing all the sentiments that Professor Marie-Claire shared with the young, wonderfully inspiring authors who's won their awards and all the other participants who've come through. It's an inspirational journey. And now thank you for all of you and all the supporting families for making us part of your journey. I have the wonderful pleasure now to introduce a fantastic group of experts who will be speaking in this international roundtable today, beginning with Miss Nicole Hatchie, who is an Inuit educator, throat singing instructor, and coordinator at the Nunavut Sivuniksavut, an educational organization providing Inuit youth with the best possible post-secondary academic and cultural learning experiences. And she'll be joined by Master Carlos Andres Oliveira Caballero, who's an activist for Indigenous peoples from Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Bolivia, also founder of the NGO Book Covers Bolivia, which provides educational opportunities for youth in his community. He has received numerous awards for his activism, leadership, and academic excellence. Next, Ms. Vanessa Kayan Rallington, who's an Indigenous climate advocate, writer, environmental journalist, animator, and UNICEF Young Influencer from Port Harcourt, Rivers State, Nigeria. She's also a research scholar at the prestigious Girls in Research, a volunteer at UNESCO Youth Orientation for Development, a UNICEF Nigeria Young Influencer, a Riplet Fellow, a Kidpreneur Ambassador, and the founder of Egalitarianism for Earth. Advocate Stacy Alvarez de la Campa is a co-founder and co-executive director of Climate Rights and Justice International. She is a legal and educational consultant and environmental activist representing Garifuna Indigenous minority. She seeks to improve the representation of Indigenous and marginalized voices in discussions about the effects of climate change. Ms. Bella Moriso-Wiskijek, Voices of Future Generations Indigenous Child Ambassador for the Sustainable Development Goals. She grew up in Saddle Lake Cree Nation on Treaty 6 and has used her skills as a young writer to advocate for the rights of First Nations families. Her speech, Honor the Treaties, has been translated into several languages, and in 2020, she became the youngest ever winner of the Global Newswoman of Vision Canada Award, which celebrates the accomplishment of women in Alberta. Ms. Afnan Daoud, environmental and human rights activist from the Al-Masri tribe, Palestine, and an ambassador for the REAM program for young environmental leaders, Jordan Branch. Finally, but not least, Ms. Bianca Noema Canteno, climate youth negotiator and legal specialist from Peru. She has further studies in climate change management, environmental and indigenous peoples law, administrative law, international human rights law, and gender law, as well as experience in monitoring cases at national and international levels and coordinating with indigenous grassroots organizations. And as Professor Marie-Claire stated, we also invite our previous distinguished speakers, Sunshine, Portia, Sydney, Adeline, and Donnie and Dominic also to join as the dialogue continues. Over to you, Professor Marie-Claire.
Our 4 questions are, how can educators, and indeed all of us, ensure that Indigenous children have positive educational experiences? What challenges do Indigenous children face to access quality education, SDG 4, and how can these barriers be overcome? How can Indigenous communities, schools, governments, and organizations work together to support Indigenous children's rights? And what challenges and opportunities exist for integrating Indigenous youth perspectives into decision-making processes? Portia, in her keynote, and Sunshine, in her starting opening remarks, have already begun this conversation, and so we can build on them. And in order to help us answer the first question, how can educators ensure that Indigenous children have positive educational experiences? I'd like to turn first to Stacey, Addie, Bella, and Sydney for your ideas. Stacey, please, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks so much. And first of all, I would have to say that I'm so honored to be here. You did get an introduction to me already. I'm part of the Garifuna Indigenous minority, originally from the very small island of Cementum and the Grenadines in the Caribbean. And I want to say, in terms of making the educational experience more enjoyable and more relatable for Indigenous children, it's important for us to first recognize how much education was used as a tool of colonialism and how much we take for granted that is an intrinsic part of education, but is actually a colonial tool. So once we start to dismantle that and come to that reckoning and that awareness, it becomes easier to see, well, we just need to contextualize education in a way that really reflects the realities and whether these are social, environmental, and cultural of the Indigenous populations and the Indigenous people, wherever you are. So an aspect of that, of course, is developing curricula that reflect cultural, historical, and social contexts. And this is to do with language, it's to do with incorporating not just Indigenous knowledge and language, but also Indigenous methodologies of teaching and learning, which are so much more immersive and so much more experiential. And actually, I think enjoyable for everyone. I know our focus is Indigenous youth and Indigenous people, but when you interact in a way that's tangible with what you're learning about, the experience is transformative. It's not just about learning it. It's about your personal development and an experience that you want to share. So I think that's the first thing, really, to move away from, in the Caribbean, we have a lot of rote memorization of things and a lot of writing and a lot of recitation. Let's move away from that and look at critical thinking, collaborative learning, and just things that, as you move into society and as you become an adult and you evolve into a person, will just kind of create connections no matter where you are. So those are a few of my thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you. And that is a wonderful way to start, especially since even the collaborations between the young people here today are part of that sort of experiential and horizontal learning that can be so inspiring. I'm going to turn now to Addie and then Bella and then Sydney to give us their ideas on how educators can ensure that Indigenous children have positive educational experiences, taking on board Stacey's point that these kinds of experiences can be more positive for everyone. Addie, what would you like to
add? I think that educators can ensure that Indigenous children have positive experiences just by making sure to educate themselves about things to do with Indigenous history and the ongoing impact of colonialism. I think it is also important to give Indigenous students options to contribute without forcing them or singling them out, but still allowing them to voice their views, opinions, and knowledge in a positive way. I've been very fortunate to learn a lot of this from my family, but it isn't fair to expect all Indigenous kids to know about their history, and it is so important to realize that for some kids and their families, some topics can be difficult, so we should leave space for them to breathe and think, because some kids aren't as confident with their identity, so try not to force or pry for information. Lastly, for kids who are more knowledgeable, providing them extra options on projects to allow them to voice their opinions is a good way to keep them interested in subjects that they may have known growing up about. Furthermore, education on Indigenous topics is much improved, and my teachers have all been great, but I know some teachers just assume that Indigenous children know about their history and the residential school and the 60s scoop, but the truth is many don't know about those things because of this.
Thank you, Addie, and that's a very good point. Bella, would you like to add to that and give your ideas?
Yeah, I feel the best way for educators to ensure a positive educational experience is by putting equity over equality. Here's what I mean. On most reserves, Indigenous children are surrounded by hard drugs and gang violence. A lot of children are raising their own parents along with themselves. I have personal friends and family where their parents wouldn't even put them through school until they were 7 or 8 years old. When they do go, it is a struggle for them to learn and keep up because they simply can't read or write, which causes them to fall behind. So many Indigenous children will either fail or drop out because they are not able to get the work done like other students. I think finding extra help in the classroom will be good because teachers cannot prioritize one student. My second point is that some students' home life can be very difficult because of drug abuse, gang violence, and emotional and physical abuse. Educators should be able to reassure students they are safe and free to be children. I believe moving classes outside, going for walks, and encouraging students to learn and experience new things will definitely ensure a positive educational experience. Also, some students have parents who work after school, and for younger students, they should not be taking care of themselves while their parents are at work. I feel that having an out-of-school care system will ensure that children are safe, fed, and taken care of at an affordable price while the parents are working. Thank you.
Those are really, really excellent ideas, Bella. And you've also put your finger on some of the biggest challenges and ways to overcome them. Thank you. I'm going to turn to Sydney now.
Some ways are like being more interactive and having more interactive lessons and like having students wanting to go to school and feeling like they're doing something and giving Indigenous people or children a place to feel welcome and safe, like maybe a group or a school club, like to make friends, like basketball or soccer or art, where there are no bullying and it's just a safe place. And have teachers understand my points of view and beliefs and not ignoring or disrespecting my cultural duties or believing in certain things and respecting where I come from, like my tribe or my house. And share and celebrate Indigenous knowledge and culture, like giving lessons about Indigenous peoples, even if they're short little ones. Giving a shout out on it, or like giving a shout out on a day that really matters in my culture.
Those are wonderful ideas as well, Sydney, and they build so well on the ideas from Bella and Addie and Stacy. I'm going to turn to our second question now, and we can continue discussing some of the ideas that have already come up, and also some of the thoughts that people have had about creating safe spaces, and also recognizing and honoring rather than sort of ignoring culture and duties and responsibilities and inspiration. And we will also, of course, think very carefully about some of the interactions and the ideas about taking classrooms outside and creating wonderful spaces for learning that are so important. And we come there especially, and we're going to turn to Bianca and Varnessa and Afnan, and then again Adi as well for answers to some of these. What are more of these challenges that Indigenous children face to access quality education, and how can these barriers be overcome? Sydney has mentioned a few, and Bella has as well. What else would you like to add? I'm going to start with Bianca, and then Varnessa, and then I'll turn to Afnan and Adi. And once we've gone through our 4 questions, we're also going to open up to anybody who would like to add things from our roundtable and also to the questions that are coming in on the Q&A. So we're going to come back to Bianca in just a second. And in the meantime, turn forward to Varnessa.
Okay, thank you so much. So I believe that Indigenous children are suffering from many challenges to access quality education. Some of them can be due to lack of representation, geographic isolation, discrimination, stereotypes, and bias, and so much more. Some of these barriers could be language or cultural barriers, and many other problems that I haven't mentioned. So I think that to overcome these challenges, we should be looking at increasing funding and resources for these Indigenous children. also incorporating Indigenous perspectives into the curriculum. This will be making it more accessible for Indigenous children when they hear that their culture, their language is being taught in a free and fair way. And also using culturally responsive teaching methods. This is a way of making it more accessible for Indigenous children. And something like geographical disparities, I think it shouldn't be a problem for Indigenous children, no matter where they are. Maybe they're staying in remote areas that do not have access to proper quality education and materials and resources for education and learning to take place. I think that government can also come to help address this challenge and provide more resources for them. So I have a quote here that actually answers this question very well by Dr. Cindy Blackstock, the Executive Director of First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She says that the biggest barrier to Indigenous children's education is not their ability to learn, but rather the willingness of governments and educators to provide them with equitable opportunities to succeed. We must move beyond the deficit discourse that blames Indigenous children and families for systematic failures of our education system and instead work to create learning environments that are culturally safe, relevant, and empowering. So this is to say that cooperation is needed if we want to address these challenges, these barriers that Indigenous children face to access quality education. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Those are excellent points, and you're bringing forward a really, really important quote as well that all of us can address and learn from. I want to be able to also recognize Balkisa Bashir, who has joined us from the Barwaka Relief Organization that deals with Indigenous and marginalized communities, involved women, children, individuals living with disabilities, whose basic needs are a challenge and who are being impacted by climate change and environmental challenges in East Africa, Kenya. And Balkisa, thank you for raising your questions on the Q&A, especially how can Indigenous girls be supported in pursuing higher education and vocational training, and how does lack of clean water and sanitation, SDG 6 of course, impact the health and well-being of Indigenous girls, which would be SDG 3 as well. And I noticed that Afnan, who offered to help us with some of the challenges together with Vanessa, Bianca, and others, is willing to answer this question live. So I'm going to turn to Afnan to give some views here.
I am Fine Dawood and I am 21 years old. I am Palestinian from West Rikot, Jerusalem, and I am from the Al-Mahtili tribe. But I hold Jordanian passport now. I never saw Palestine. My family lived there for generation after generation, surrounded by forests. I have always dreamed to see Palestine. My grandparents were forced to leave Palestine 76 years ago by Zionist armed gangs that also killed thousands of Palestinians then. Sadly, history is repeated now in Gaza, the world now, yet little action is taken. In the past, people claimed ignorance about the situation in Palestine. But now, with social media live stream from Gaza and the rest of occupied Palestine, there are no excuses. Israel continues to kill and kidnap Palestine, including children. It's heartbreaking. Gaza is under siege, no food, no water, and no medicine. Doctors do surgery and cut children's limbs to save their lives without anesthesia. There is none. Can you imagine the pain? And now most hospitals are destroyed by the Israeli occupation army. So this gives you an idea about challenges facing Palestinian children to access education. Actually, no schooling since October 2023. One complete school year is stolen from children. More than 600,000 children were denied education. How did access to education become an impossible dream? All schools in Gaza have become shelters during the war. But then 8 out of 10 schools bombed and destroyed, often with children and refugees inside. Also, many teachers are killed. Now, Palestinian families live in tents, and Israel army bombing the tent. Children buried alive inside them. surviving, have no hospital to treat them. What education to worry about? Death? War? Not only challenge but the end of everything. Alive children and teachers busy searching for food and water every day for a long hour to feed their families. How to overcome barriers? First, stop the genocide. Stop Israel from killing us daily.
Yes.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And I'm going to turn to Nishan if you'd like to just add a couple of words, given your experience and also your expertise in addressing situations of conflict.
Thank you, Marie-Claire, and also to all the speakers, but also Afnan for bringing home the realities of the day. I think the cultures of violence and all the speakers, Professor Marie-Claire, who spoke before Afnan, talked about institutionalized violence. And unfortunately, we live in a time that warfare has institutionalized most of institutions. And that affects the culture of violence, which spreads across the world. And as we come together here, especially listening to young people from indigenous cultures, it shows there is hope for reconnecting with our methods of reconciliation. And I think that's a powerful voice of change that needs to address these things. It seems that everything is lost in the areas where armed conflict is taking place, whether it's in Gaza or in Ukraine or over 100 odd other armed conflicts going on in the world today. And that's why we have to resolve to be resilient and collaborate. And I'm using the words of the wonderful, inspiring young authors who spoke before me. And that is a message of peace that we really need to work towards. And I think through you all speaking out, coming together, that's the only way that we're going to save humanity and protect future generations from war and move us all towards a culture of peace. So thank you for doing what you all are doing and inspiring all of us. Thank you, Professor Marie-Claire.
Thank you to my co-chair friend, and also to Afnan and all of the young people who have spoken. Bianca is back online with us, and I want to give her a chance as well to bring up some of the challenges and solutions, ways to overcome barriers. Bianca.
Thank you so much. I also want to show solidarity with the Palestinian people and also to raise for the genocide to stop. Following with the question about the challenges of indigenous youth, I think it's important in this time, at least for the Peruvian indigenous, I'm sure also replicates with other realities, to talk about the sexual violence that many young and children indigenous youth in Peru are facing, especially one nation, the One Piece and Aguajún nation, that in this year made a complaint with about 500 cases of sexual violence in their schools. So this abuse was perpetrated mainly for teachers, and this adds layers of trauma, fear, and mistrust to the educational environment, making it even unsafe, even more unsafe, particularly for girls, even to attend to school. And this is within an institutional and a weak institutional and racism government that in one of the remarks made by the governments, they said this violence was cultural practices, and this reflects a systemic issue of discrimination and racism and the lack of importance for the governments, especially in colonized governments like the Peruvian one, the view of what indigenous and especially what children's are, indigenous children's are, they mean. So I think it's important to acknowledge, and definitely a way to address this huge barrier is creating a safe educational environment and strengthening legal and institutional responses. Especially giving a response to the impunity of all these cases that now in Peru, they have only around 10 cases of the 500 with justice. So if this is not addressed, children, especially girls, won't able to go to school in a safe environment.
Thank you, Bianca. These are really good points. I'm going to turn to Addie, who had also offered some answers.
I think that mostly Indigenous children can be singled out. For example, in my experience, a school district that I was in said that one of their music programs needed to be cut so that they could afford additional assistance in Indigenous students. And they announced this and broadcasted it publicly. This can cause Indigenous students to be uncomfortable and feel unsafe, and that's why my parents chose to move me to private school. At my current school, I believe that they do a good job offering Indigenous kids the opportunity to run National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, or Orange Shirt Day as it's commonly known, and contribute in class, at least with the teachers. This opportunity means that I may not be the best person to speak about barriers, but Indigenous students who live on reserves are often in smaller communities, which means smaller schools and fewer options. If they live outside of walking distance, it can be difficult for parents or family members to get them to school, making it difficult for these kids to access education. I know that I moved to private school because of how my school district compared music to Indigenous education, but many families don't have this opportunity, as their families can't afford it. So making it accessible for these students to go to a school where they feel safe and have opportunities I've had to learn is important. I've met other Indigenous kids through the opportunities I've had at SMO, and some of them are now good friends. My public elementary school was also good with this, as my dad got involved in making a totem with the school as well as drumming and music and more. But there wasn't the same opportunity to meet other Indigenous kids at the school, which can be nice for Indigenous students to see that there is other Indigenous students and be able to meet them. Overall, quality education for Indigenous students has a long way to go.
Thank you, Addie. And that is a very good point about having a long way to go with all of the barriers that are being faced, as Bianca and Afnan and Vanessa and everyone who has addressed this question has underlined. And it is important, so important, as Nishan said, in thinking and recognizing those answers, that we have courage and we have hope and we try our very, very best to overcome these barriers. I'm going to turn now to the question of how can Indigenous communities, schools, governments, and organizations work together to support Indigenous children's rights? And we've had some answer to this question already, but I'm going to turn to a few more who have joined us online and have volunteered in advance to give us a few answers how to work together to support Indigenous children's rights.
So I just want to introduce myself quickly again. I'm Nicole Hashi. I'm Inuk. I grew up in Baker Lake, Nunavut. I've been living in Ottawa for a little bit. But just to go straight to the question, I feel like the obvious question is collaboration. But for me, it's like, what would that look like? And I think for the most part, a lot of the collaborations and the meetings would happen in a government setting or in a boardroom, etc. And I feel like a different way to approach that would be to get into the communities themselves. So as someone mentioned previously, that a lot of Indigenous communities are isolated or very small or not walking distance. So I feel like actually having those important meetings about the Indigenous children in their own communities. Then again, there are some barriers to that, like financials and everything, or accommodations. That being said, I feel like that approach could really be an eye-opener and also develop different kind of relationships and appreciation for the families that are living in the Indigenous communities as well.
Very, very good points. Thank you, Nicole. I'm going to turn now to Vanessa. You had some ideas about ways to work together?
I believe that cooperation is a very effective way of solving any problem, including supporting Indigenous children's rights to education and cultural expression. So all I'm going to be talking about is cooperation, and this cooperation is not that as if everybody's just going to come together to work on a particular thing. Everybody has a role to play in supporting Indigenous children's rights. So for the communities themselves, I believe that Indigenous communities should try to improve representation and not be suppressed by other people's opinions. If they keep looking about what others think of them, they won't develop properly to address these Indigenous children's rights. And also developing community-based programs that help members of the community, both children and youth. Then when we come to the schools, I believe that educators should try their best to provide with culturally responsive teaching methods, as well as inculcating indigenous perspectives into the school curriculum and providing a safe learning environment whereby equality and cooperation among indigenous and non-indigenous children is being supported. And then for the government, because I believe that the government has the highest say, like power, they should be able to address some systematic biases like historical traumas, things that have caused fights and wars between two particular indigenous communities. When there's peace, it helps to foster collaboration in supporting and meeting to the needs of these indigenous children, as well as policy development. I didn't say policy like creations, because I know there are many policies and laws for these indigenous children, but I think that these policies should be supported more and enforced properly so that these indigenous children's rights will be protected, not just only the right to education, but also cultural expression, etc. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very good points. I'm going to turn now to Carlos Andres. I know it's the first time you have a chance to speak, and we would love to hear your thoughts on how we can work together.
Certainly. Thank you. Well, first of all, it's quite a pleasure to be with you guys. Thank you very much for having me. Well, my name is Carlos, as you may see there on the screen. Well, I'm from Bolivia, and just to contextualize very rapidly, in my country, there is also a very strong presence of indigenous people. Our constitution recognizes actually that we are a plurinational state, which means that we have recognized in our constitution, as I say, 36 different nationalities inside our country. That is to say 36 different indigenous ethnicities. And therefore, that is a very important background you guys need to have in mind when I'm going to offer this answer. But well, just to be very brief, what I think we should do to collaborate with indigenous communities, governments, schools, working together to support this indigenous children's rights is to be able to somehow collaborate in advocating for the inclusion of political and social activists and classes in the education system. And this is something that I have noticed is missing in my country, where, as you guys can see, we have the liberty to advocate for indigenous people, but people, and especially young people, don't know how to do it. Therefore, these classes, I think, should equip students with, let's say, skills, knowledge, and methodologies that are necessary to achieve those high impact outcomes in advancing and protecting the rights of indigenous children. So I think that by integrating these educational programs, we empower these young indigenous individuals to lead and participate in social projects and apply political pressure where necessary, of course. So I think this approach kind of ensures that our generation is not only aware that we have our rights in our country to advocate for indigenous people, but we can also actively engage in these processes to protect and enhance those rights. So I would certainly like to remark that, and well, thank you very much for the time.
That's a really, really good point, Carlos. And actually, even events like this one, just helping people to become comfortable with their voices and to share their stories and support each other and inspire each other helps with that empowerment that is so important. Again, with a shout out to Addie and Sydney and Donnie and Dominic for sharing their stories, and their stories will reach hundreds, maybe even thousands more with the books that are being written and illustrated, and will be made available for free on the Voices website and also on Amazon for those who want to be able to order them in print on demand. I think all of that is part of the empowerment that we all seek. But you're completely right that organizing that is needed is what helps to lead us to that. I'm going to invite all of our speakers to look on the Q&A because there's some really, really good questions coming in. I want to thank especially Joseph Denubetu, who is asking some questions about the UN level. Ala Al-Mahsari, who is joining Adnan and others about the right of children in Palestine to live. Gia Gaspard Taylor, who is bringing up some of the ideas in Trinidad and Tobago to open ways for children to register. and also Vulate Asare, and I think it's Daryl at the Ravenclaw Reporter who is signaling on some really, really great questions online. So I'm going to invite all our speakers to both type answers, and then also we will ask you to come back and see if you have any answers to any of these questions. But speaking of which, in terms of how Indigenous communities, schools, governments, and organizations can work together to support Indigenous children's rights. So Stacey and then Cindy.
Sure, thanks so much for the opportunity to focus on that question. So I think the important aspect of collaboration is we spoke about acknowledging the fact that a lot of the high level of mistrust of institutions. So I think it's really important for this kind of collaboration to be curated at a local community-led level. So it's, and I love the point that was made by a previous speaker about this happening outside of institutional spaces and happening within communities. So that does take levels of organization, it takes levels of planning, and most importantly, it takes levels of funding. I think it's really important for us to recognize the necessity to create definitive plans and participatory programs that can be funded, apply for various funding streams, whether it's grants or whatever it is. But I think creating a concrete program that includes, obviously, Indigenous voices. They're centered in Indigenous communities. They're taking place in Indigenous communities. And then these funding streams could also be ways that Indigenous people could have various levels of exchanges amongst various Indigenous communities. I know as an Indigenous person of Caribbean descent, I hardly ever meet anyone else who is Indigenous. And I think there are times when that level, this level of collaboration and this level of meeting one another face to face, so not just virtually, but also in person, can really help to boost the motivation and the self-affirmation that we need to keep moving forward. So I think those are some thoughts I have from that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good point. And I want to thank you especially for signaling and raising awareness about the Garifuna people and about your heritage and history, because with that, we can, of course, immediately invite you to be part of these discussions and to inspire others. And slowly that empowerment that Carlos Andres spoke about and that Sydney and Addie are helping us to live out and that Bianca and Vanessa and others are calling for starts to be built. So I'm going to turn last to Sydney for her answers to how Indigenous communities, schools, governments, and organizations can work together to support Indigenous children's rights. Sydney, just a few thoughts, and then over the next.
They can work together by communicating and having meetings, talking about what they can do better together and what wouldn't work well, and make changes to support Indigenous children. They can share knowledge with each other to have understanding of the rights of Indigenous child to ensure these rights are practiced and upheld in all places where children need to feel safe. Together they can teach children about their rights to let them understand about what's going on in their community and school so they can help as they are children, and when they are older they will know what to do and what won't help. And they can understand to change the future. They can do this by taking the time to learn about our past and our culture and what not to do in the future to not mess up more. Thank you.
Thank you, Sydney. And that's a really good point. We've spoken about opportunities for integrating Indigenous youth perspective into decision making, which isn't just politics. It's all the decisions we make in our communities, in what kinds of books are going to be focused on in our schools, as Portia mentioned in her keynote speech, in what kind of stories and culture and literature and languages and even science and traditional knowledge we're going to value. And so I would love if you would like to just give us maybe one idea each on integrating Indigenous youth perspectives into decision making.
Thank you. To answer that question, something that popped into my mind is that, just a little background, I work at Nunavut Siwiniksvut College. So the college that I work at is specifically for Inuit students. And one of our main priorities there is Inuit self-advocacy in a safe space. That being said, we do some exercises like mock consultations or mock community discussions where every student would have a role. But I think practicing those professional strategies, and that their opportunity to speak goes a long way. And that could be one idea on how to move forward, and having Inuit and other Indigenous youth more confident in their speaking as well.
Absolutely. Thank you. That is a very good idea. I'm going to ask Bianca and then Carlos Andres. Bianca.
Thank you. I think this question for me, it's really inspiring because I work in an NGO that focuses of canalizing international cooperation and to give it to the ground communities, and we have worked with youth collective that have developed their own social environmental projects and also educational projects by themselves. So I think it's important idea of shift the power, that is a growing movement, especially in international cooperation, to basically directly involve indigenous youth in decision-making process, which means that they can develop and execute their own ideas, their own activities, and we only provide them the resources, the knowledge, and of course a little bit of technical guidance, but the ideas and execution are made of them. And we have examples of success of this model of shift the power model with indigenous collectives in Peru that have done different projects, from awareness workshop on wildlife in the Amazon, environmental awareness workshops and the importance of recycling also in the Amazon, and even they have built greenhouses for food security in their own communities, being the young people that is doing this. So I think it's important to acknowledge the power, the identity, and the agency of indigenous youth and children.
Thank you, Bianca. Those are great ideas. And Carlos Andres?
Yes, certainly. What I think is something very important for allowing this participation of indigenous youth perspectives into decision making is having them as part of the government, but in a way that is both participate, let's just say, allows them to participate and also liberates them from these political pressures. And the way we have done such a thing in my community in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, is by creating a departmental youth council. And this was enacted actually by departmental law in 2011. And therefore, we have this departmental youth council that we call Consejo Departamental de la Juventud in Spanish. And the way we work is we are a non-political organism of our government. But what we do is we ensure that the decisions and the actions are guided by the needs and voices of the youth rather than the political agendas of the politicians of every single administration. So one of the key features of this council is that we are a highly equitable structure, and we need to have the representation of indigenous people in this council. And therefore, we have been able to work in several projects along the years in order to allow these voices being heard in the decision-making process. So I would certainly recommend and raise awareness on all of the leaders here in this meeting so that you guys can create something similar in your communities, work along your government, as I say, not in this political space, but more in the directing active participation of youth people, but especially in that area. So that would be my commentary there.
Thank you very much, Carlos Andres. I'm going to turn to Nishan to bring into this conversation on exactly this point some of the questions we've received on the Q&A, and then we're going to ask Stacey and Bella to give their answers to this question, but also to the others that are coming in on the same point in the Q&A.
Plenty of questions, tough to choose, but I've selected one from Wulate Tetazare from Ghana. I would ask kindly for Stacey to respond if possible. The question is, sometimes having conversation with children about the kind of society or development they would like and what the challenges are and how to overcome them, are able to express themselves through their own language. But writing is quite challenging. Could the ideas be recorded or transcribed, any given credit for that, and also published in their languages? Is that the question for Stacey? Stacey, any thoughts?
Sure, yeah. I think that's a great idea because that in and of itself could be like a community-based, almost like a leadership project. And it can be a way, rather than frame it so that it's framed around the idea of victimhood, like, giving Indigenous children voices, it can be just simply an advocacy program or a program to learn about activism and a program to learn about even something as simple as speaking and expression and even cultural expression. So if we create a program that the aim and the objective is to have kids come together and talk and build their confidence, kind of a co-benefit of that would, of course, be recording it and transcribing it and creating a case study. But again, having the object as like a case study or recording it, I think that's something that seems to separate the humanity of what a project like this is about. Because we have to move towards building up children and giving Indigenous children the opportunities that other children have. So I think that's a great idea for a project, and a project that can be meaningful in a way that can extend beyond just the children, but it can have great intergenerational resonance. So I think that's something. I always do this. I think, this would be a great project for me to start, but I have like 50 million projects going, but I would actually take this on, and it can be something done small. Like it can be done on a local level. It can be done with a few children, and it's something that you can see it's replicable and scalable. So yeah, those are my thoughts on it. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we're going to turn to Bella for the final word to the question that Meishan brought.
Yeah, I had a point for the integrating youth perspectives into decision-making processes.
Yeah.
Many Indigenous youth experience complicated forms of intergenerational trauma and structural violence, which originate from colonization, such as food insecurity, housing insecurity, increased risk of drug abuse, sexual and/or physical violence, and mental health challenges. The socio-structural and political conditions prevent Indigenous youth to participate equitably in society. These youths have remarkable knowledge, creativity, and strength-based solutions to express who they are, contribute to the well-being of their community, and create their own pathways towards resilience.
Thank you, Bella. That's a really, really good answer. And actually, that's an excellent note. We could stay online and discuss all of these issues for so much longer, because that's exactly what this forum is meant to be for. But this is just the beginning of a conversation, and it's a continuing intergenerational conversation. And it's one that we are guided in with people like Sydney and Addie and Donnie and Dominic and yourself, and everyone else who has kindly taken the time to join us today in this discussion. I have to thank everyone, especially my co-chair, Nishan Gunasekara, who himself understands very well the challenges of living in conflict situations and the need to respect human rights and the rights especially of children from both a personal and a professional and an expert view. It has been a great beginning to this conversation. I really hope it will continue. I hope to see Nicole online and in these discussions. Zunaida, Ella, and Odette, I want to pass the microphone back to you for the special closing remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mary Claire and Nishan. So thank you so much. As the event comes to an end, I am now honored to invite Advocate Wayne Garnons-Williams to share some special closing remarks. Advocate Garnons-Williams is Plains Cree from Treaty 6, Muslim First Nation, and a distinguished leader and advocate in Indigenous legal and economic affairs. He is the CEO of the National 60 Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada, president of the International Intertribal Trade and Investment Organization, and serves as a senior lawyer at Garwill Law Professional Corporation, principal director at Indigenous Sovereign Trade Consultancy, and lecturer in the Indigenous Entrepreneurship Program at the University of Waterloo. He has been recognized with several awards, including the 2019 Excellence in Aboriginal Relations Award from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, the 2020 Queen's University Alumni Award, and the 2021 International Legal Specialist in Peace, Justice, and Governance Award from the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. He also received the 2022 Senior Legal Fellow designation from CISDL and the 2024 Sidney J. Picker Award from the Canada-United States Law Institute. Additionally, he was honored with the HRS Ryan Law Alumni Award of Distinction from Queen's University and the Oklahoma Supreme Court Sovereignty Symposium Medallion for outstanding contributions to Indigenous legal issues. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Advocate Wayne Garnons Williams, who I am very pleased to hand over the floor to.
Thank you very much, everyone. It's a real honor to be here and to look at discussions. I mean, I just, before I go into my formal stuff, I want to talk about just a little bit about, acknowledge the fact that childhood trauma is something that our foundation is examining from both a personal interactive sense, but also a historical sense, because our foundation is all about healing. And when we look at trauma, we look at the fact that there are two ways to go with specifically childhood trauma, and that is a static approach where it's victimhood and it's a solo experience. But we want to move to more of a healing model where it's interactive and it's forward thinking and it's a group experience that everyone in that healing process benefits from. So just want to park that there because I think it's kind of the work that we're immersed in too. So thank you for this wonderful session. This has been great. And just I'll go to my formal stuff here. Yes, the National 60 Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada is delighted and honored to provide the closing remarks for today's International Roundtable on Indigenous Children's Voices and Rights. Now, just a little bit of background here. The term 60 Scoop, for some of you who may not know, refers to, I quote, the government practice between approximately 1951 and 1991 of the removal by the state of Indigenous babies and children without the consent of their parents from their Indigenous homes. Now, these children, these Indigenous babies and children were then either placed in foster care or adoption in non-Indigenous homes and left without, or even worse, left without family care and forced to grow up in the child welfare institution. So that's basically the general definition of what 60 Scoop refers to. Now, our foundation, I'm going to refer to it as the foundation because it's a mouthful, but our foundation came into existence in 2018, and as a result of a class action settlement for compensation for 60 Scoop victims. And as a result of that, the foundation was formed. Now, the foundation is an independent charity, and we serve all survivors of the 60 Scoop, whether they are Inuit, First Nation, or Métis, from all regions across Canada. Now, our vision of our foundation is to ensure that survivors have a community filled with healing and wellness, and to educate the world about the survivors' experiences and histories. And the foundation believes that meaningful policy change and societal transformation is best brought about through education, collective innovation, creativity, and advocacy, including events like we just had today, to have these dialogues and interactions where it educates, inspires, and informs for movement forward. So in the past 4 years since the inception of our foundation, I'm proud to say that we've successfully managed we've successfully given out in grants over $9.6 million to 53 organizations across Canada, in each region of Canada, to Inuit, First Nation, and Métis Scoop survivor groups to begin the work of healing our survivor communities through reclamation, reunion, cultural practices, and reconnecting them to what has been lost. Now, the foundation is truly honored to support the important work of the Voices for Future Generations, and we celebrate all the wonderful child authors that this program has inspired. So thank you for this wonderful event and the excellent discussions today. And thank you for all the great writing that all the Indigenous children authors create and publish for the rest of the world to enjoy, read, and learn from and grow. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Wayne, for your always so inspiring and powerful words. Now we are once again honored to welcome Elder Philomene Sanderson to close with prayer. We want to thank the National 60 Scoop Healing Foundation of Canada, all our speakers, chairs, moderators, and participants from across the world for your very wonderful contributions. We are also happy to announce that our next roundtable on education, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the World's Sustainable Development Goals will be taking place on September 8th in celebration of World Literacy Day, in partnership with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law.
Register and have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.